In this unit, we'll discuss how the realities of learning English as a second language in outer and expanding circle conflict with the SLA paradigm, the orthodox SLA paradigm, or the assumptions that SLA makes for second language learning. The more we think about it, the more we realize that the classical SLA paradigm is completely inapplicable to the context of English language learning in the outer and expanding circle. We see that there's a lot of disconnect between what actually happens in these contexts and what SLA presumes. What makes this disconnect, or what makes the SLA paradigm inapplicable in the world English's context, are these facts. The first fact is that in these contexts we have multilingual users. We do not have monolingual users as we do in the inner circle countries, where everybody knows only, or majority of the people know only, English. The world English's context of language use comprises people who are mostly multilinguals. And English is used in different domains along with the other languages in the repertoire of these people. And therefore, these people need only a certain degree of proficiency in English, the degree of proficiency which is required to function in a particular domain. Let's take the example of of a woman who works as a secretary for a multilingual company, a multinational company, in Pakistan. So this lady, whose job is to perform the functions of a secretary, she only needs a certain degree of proficiency in English. She doesn't need to write research reports. She doesn't need to conduct meetings in English or make presentations at conferences in English. So her need for English is very limited. So she may be very proficient in that particular domain. She may know English very well to complete or to undertake her job. That doesn't mean that she is deficient and she knows only restricted English. She knows the amount of English which is required by her to perform a particular function in English very well. What these multilingual people do is that they employ the other languages in their linguistic repertoire to perform certain functions or to put their message across. So when there's a situation where one language is not enough, they can easily switch to the other language. And this switching works both ways. They can switch from English to their primary language and vice versa. The other fact is that most of the input that these people receive is local. One of the assumptions of SLA is that the learners should receive, or the entire range or depth of the standard English should be available, or the standard language should be available for the learners. Whereas in this context, we see that the input that the learners receive is local. They are taught by teachers who have proficiency in an indigenized variety of English, and then they also employ bilingual teaching methods, which means that they make a lot of use of the first language of the learners to teach English. So instead of wasting time in trying to explain a concept to learners in English when using an equivalent in the learner's mother tongue can solve the problem. So they make use of this bilingual teaching method. students do get some exposure, learners do get some exposure to English language and culture outside the classroom, but as a result of this exposure, they do not become Americanized. They, on the other hand, indigenize the American culture. So, what they have in their own context is an indigenized version of pop, let's say, American culture. The same is true for the use of the internet. We see that a lot of innovation and creativity is being used when it comes to using the internet in the outer and expanding circle. So what the people who use internet are learning is not the standard variety of English, but an indigenized variety of English. They make innovations in the use of the language, and this results in the emergence of an indigenized variety as a result of the use of the internet. So what we have is an indigenized variety and not the emergence of an international or universal English as a result of learning of English in the outer and expanding circle. Another point which makes these SLA concepts irrelevant is the aim or the target for learning English in the world English's context is not the attainment of target like native like proficiency. They do not need native like proficiency. They need proficiency which will enable them to communicate in their own circle, which is a non-native English speaking circle. So they do not really need to have the same accent and pronunciation as native English speakers or proficiency in other areas which is required for functioning completely in English. Therefore, we cannot label the use of English in outer expanding circle as a fossilized variety of English or a sample or an example of interlanguage, because the differences that we see in outer expanding circle varieties of English from the native English, these differences are not a result of any deficiency on the part of the users of English, but they are a result of the reality of the use of English in these contexts. So what we have is indigenized varieties as a result of instruction of English in these contexts and not the emergence of a universal English. We cannot compare these varieties with creolization either. Creolization means when one variety of a language is used by the second generation of language users. But in case of English, there's no question of first or second generation. English is used by all the generations, but for limited functions and purposes. Another point on which the teaching of English in the world English's context differs from SLA is the role of first or primary languages. The SLA paradigm, the classical SLA paradigm, completely rejects the role of the learner's first languages. Whereas in these contexts, in the world English's context, we see that the students' primary languages play a positive role in their learning of the second language, that is English. So the innovations that they make with English help them in two ways. One is that it increases their communicative competence in the target language, which means that if the use of the target language, complete use of the target language was likely to make communication difficult for with their interlocutors, the use of the first language makes it easier, and then it also helps in acculturation of English. So the nativization of English is also becomes easier with the use of learner's first language for the learning of English in the world English's context. So we see that the SLA, classical SLA paradigm does not have full applicability in the learning of English in outer and expanding circles.